The Gundam franchise has been around for 40 years. In that time, there's been well over 50 television shows, movies, and direct-to-video miniseries. It's an awful lot to wrap your head around, particularly if you're new to the franchise. At first glance, Gundam may seem pretty bloated. That much material all built into a singular thing should result in a story and franchise that is impenetrable to anyone other than already bought-in diehards. But a decade into its life, Gundam creator studio Sunrise figured out that the best way for them to tell original Gundam stories without getting too bogged down in the series' own mythology and rules was for them to create multiple Gundam timelines. These timelines present opportunities for creators to tell self-contained stories that don't necessarily jive with the themes or setting of the original Gundam, and may make for more natural entry points for newcomers by giving them smaller bits of Gundam to wrestle with. In this series of videos, I'm going to briefly touch on each Gundam timeline, and talk about whether its series might make for a good entry point for those looking to give Gundam a try. Now, despite all that talk about alternate Gundam timelines, let's start instead at the beginning. For many, there's nothing better than the original setting of Gundam, the Universal Century. The Universal Century is the setting of the original Mobile Suit Gundam, and it is by far the most developed and most revisited of the Gundam timelines. Set in the future after mankind has created space colonies in orbit around the Earth, stories in the Universal Century mostly tell the tale of the wars between the Earth Federation, the One World Government, and Zeon, a nation of rebelling space colonies. As time goes on, both alternate between which plays the antagonist, mostly Zeon, though it often turns out that they both are. Much of the story focuses on the genesis of spaceborne psychics, who may have the potential for enabling humanity to move past war through achieving mutual understanding, or maybe just escalate war in horrifying new directions. Further down in the Universal Century chronology, the Zeon versus Federation dynamic is superseded by a number of standalone wars between people vaguely associated with the Federation and other non-Zeon space-dwelling bad guys. But there's very few stories set in that bit, so who cares? When people talk about the Universal Century, they tend to focus on its grit, the shades of gray aspects of its politics, and the relatively grounded nature of its characters and stories. It's certainly the timeline that brokers the most nostalgia, which has a lot to do with why they keep setting more and more series within the same year-long span as the original series. If you're the kind of person who is interested in seeing what counts as classic Gundam, or to whom its complex space politics and retro styling may appeal to, the Universal Century is certainly worth checking out. Of course, being the most revisited setting, it has the most baggage, which makes it easily the hardest timeline to jump into willy-nilly. But there's a self-contained plot through line made up of Mobile Suit Gundam, Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, Mobile Suit Gundam Double Zeta, and Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack. This chronology makes up the heart of the Universal Century, or more accurately, the spine, I suppose. So, if you're wanting to see the central story of the Universal Century, the best place to start, of course, would be at the very beginning, with 1979's Mobile Suit Gundam. Though you have to approach it with the right mindset. It's old, and its production was troubled, and boy does it show. I'd actually recommend skipping the television show altogether, and watch the compilation movie trilogy instead, as they are tighter, better animated, and have an actual ending. Though the series' Monster of the Week goofiness and constant fight to stay on model does have its own charm. If you like the original Gundam, you should then definitely check out Zeta, Double Zeta, and Char's Counterattack, at which point the timeline is basically your oyster. Though Gundam Unicorn and its direct sequel Gundam Narrative, as well as the soon-to-come Hathaway's Flash movies, are direct follow-ups to the throughline plot, and tie much more into Gundam's central narrative than most. On the other hand, if you're wanting more of a sampler and aren't necessarily looking to drink straight from the UC fire hose quite yet, or if you're wanting something with more of a modern storytelling and aesthetic sensibility, the Universal Century has some great standalone stories as well. Mobile Suit Gundam 8th MS Team is a short, self-contained miniseries set during the same time as the original Gundam, but it instead doubles down on the grounded aspects of the one-year war between the Federation and Zeon by presenting a Gundam story that's more or less Gundam meets the Vietnam War, wrapped around a star-crossed lover story. Mobile Suit Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket is another self-contained miniseries set at the very end of the One-Year War, but is instead hyper-focused on Gundam's anti-war message, with some very powerful pathos. It's probably the Gundam series that is least compromised in its themes, achieved through its civilian viewpoint, balanced representation of both sides of the conflict, and its overt criticism of the war fetishism that is inherent to Gundam being a show for kids. On the other hand, Mobile Suit Gundam Thunderbolt December Sky is a movie also set at the very end of the One-Year War, but instead turns the grit knob to 11, presenting an incredibly well-animated, action-packed visual smorgasbord of jazz, bad things happening to good people, and death. It's one of the tightest, darkest bits of Gundam, though also the most stylish. The Universal Century is great. It's easily my favorite timeline all in all, though it wasn't my first. Next time, join me as we take a look at Sunrise's first foray into alternate Gundam settings by making Gundam into a Kung Fu Super Robot series? What Gundam series was your first? What Universal Century series do you think would be the best for newcomers? Tear each other apart in the comments.